And hello, everyone. Welcome to the Social Justice Forums. I am Daren, Jaime. We thank you for joining us. If you're asking the question, what is this show all about? Well, we bring you a forum providing a deeper understanding of the issues and the inequities that so many people face, things from systemic inequalities to pressing social problems. Our guests provide multiple perspectives and insights, helping us better understand and address these challenges. So we invite you to stay connected to us as the Social Justice Forums starts now. And welcome back. For over 50 years, Legal Momentum has been at the forefront of national civil rights efforts, tirelessly dedicated to advancing gender equality. The Women Valued Initiative aims to amplify the needs and voices of some of the most underserved in the economy, including women of color, immigrant women, workers in low-wage industries, and survivors of gender-based violence. Joining me now, we are pleased to have the Director of Economic Justice at Legal Momentum, Seher Khawaja, and we thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Daren. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. And when we talk about the issue of gender inequality, I mean, obviously, this is a conversation that we've been having for years, and we're still having it again to this day. From your perspective, obviously there have been some things have gotten better, but how do you see things playing out right now?
Well, Daren, you mentioned that we've been doing this work for over 50 years now. I think that speaks to, on the one hand, kind of our deep, rich knowledge on these issues, but it also speaks to the intractability of these issues. We have been fighting for a very long time to achieve basic equity for women. I think we have come through a pandemic where we have seen much more closely how women in many of these essential lower wage industries support our economy, support our society, how they are invaluable to our survival. And yet we're really still struggling to achieve basic rights, basic economic security for many of these women. And that just is kind of scratching the surface. I think there are so many dimensions to this issue. Obviously, post-Dobbs, we are in an era where women's rights have been further eroded. And so we have a lot of battles on our hand, but we're still fighting. And I think every erosion is also an opportunity to come together and to build back stronger protections, because we know that the ones that we have right now are not sufficient.
We had our challenges before COVID, and now since COVID, what has the fight been like, and what's it been like? What have you noticed in terms of gender inequality and how we've been dealing in this matter since COVID?
You know, unfortunately, I think there was some momentum during the COVID pandemic. I think many of the issues that we have long been trying to bring to the forefront were much more obvious, right? The deep inequities that exist for so many women in our society, the fact that we rely on them, we don't pay women enough. They became very obvious, the things that we're constantly trying to put out there. But unfortunately, we're still really fighting. And I think, just to give you a little bit of background, based on the work that we've been doing, based on the research we've done, based on the research of many of our partner organizations, we know that across the country, women still earn less, are paid less, have less wealth, and are more economically insecure. And the implications for women of color are drastically worse. Women of color are facing intersecting forms of discrimination based on gender and race. And that means that they face the highest rates of economic insecurity in our country. Nationally, I think looking at the gender pay gap is a really good way of understanding the issue. Nationally, if you take into account full-time and part-time work, women make approximately 78 cents per every dollar that a man makes. And then if you dig down to look at women of color, the figures are appalling, right? Black women make approximately 66 cents for every dollar a white non-Hispanic man makes. Latina women make 52 cents. 52 cents for every dollar a white non-Hispanic man makes in this country. And that's kind of just the beginning of it, right? We know that women of color are more likely to work low wage, minimum wage jobs. We know that they're more likely to have difficulty accessing decent, affordable, high quality childcare. They're oftentimes relying on family members. They are more likely to work precarious in precarious exploitative working conditions. And as a result of many of these factors, they're more likely to either live in poverty or be at risk of living in poverty. These were the realities we were facing before the pandemic. These are the realities that we continue to face post-pandemic. And I think one thing we need to be explicitly clear about is that these disparities are the direct result of kind of long-term systemic discrimination that exists in our economy, as well as discrimination that exists on the surface.
Right.
And we really need bold and urgent action to address these inequities. And I think there is, thankfully, due to the pandemic, more momentum, more collaboration around doing those things, but it's not urgent enough.
Yeah, Seher, as the director of economic justice at Legal Momentum, using that word momentum, talk to me about some of the projects you have. What are the things that you're really doing in terms of at Legal Momentum to really help in this fight that is certainly uphill and very much necessary?
Well, Daren, as you mentioned, Legal Momentum is a national civil rights organization dedicated to advancing gender equality. I think traditionally our focus has been and continues to be on advancing the rights of women, but as our conceptions of gender have evolved, our work has evolved to take into account the rights of transgender individuals, non-binary individuals. We do work in different ways. We engage in impact litigation, so trying to bring cases where we are really trying to have an impact on challenging gender discrimination in our society. We engage in policy and legislative work, so trying to enact cutting edge legislation to really address some of those underlying structures that we feel are discriminatory and problematic. And then we engage in educational know your rights initiatives. So we're training people across the spectrum, from judges to advocates to women workers to students. And we have a national helpline. And some of the issues that we focus on and have focused on throughout our 50 years are violence against women. We were critical in helping to draft and enact the Federal Violence Against Women Act and to get it reauthorized over the years. We work on equity in education, fairness in the courts. Reproductive rights is a space where we have kind of upped our game in the past years. We've worked there historically, but now we're doing more work in that space to kind of address the urgent need. And of course, we do a lot of work on workplace equality and economic justice. As you mentioned, one of our core focuses is really centering the needs and the voices of women who we feel are most underserved in our economy. And I think when we think about what's happening to women in those areas, there are a number of drivers of inequity that we're particularly concerned about. So unpaid caregiving, for example, is a big problem. We know that women have disproportionately been tasked with unpaid caregiving responsibilities that result in a number of financial costs and penalties over the course of their career. And that's something we need to address. We know that as a result of those caregiving responsibilities, employers come to the table with a lot of conscious and unconscious biases about women's work, and that factors in very centrally in how employers choose to pay women and how they decide to, when they decide to hire them. Another big problem that we really are trying to address is the problem of occupational segregation. We've seen in our work that women have been disproportionately pushed into low wage work. And low wage work that is low wage precisely because it's considered women's work. And so, again, that's another one of those deep structural problems that we need to break apart. And then lastly, pay secrecy is a big issue we're concerned about. I think as we know, for too long, employers have been able to um, perpetuate pay inequity because it's impossible to unearth both kind of like discrete disparities, but also that those kind of global inequities that exist within our economy. And so, in that respect, pay transparency is a big issue that we are really focusing on and have worked on over the course of the past several years. And I'm happy to talk about that more.
I do want to go back to occupational segregation because I think that so many times people are in the dark when it comes to occupational segregation. That it really doesn't exist until it's almost it's like it hits you in the face. So let's go back there for a moment, unpack this a little bit more, because when we talk about how prevalent this is, how are you seeing it from across, from your office when it comes to occupational segregation?
Yeah, I think in the gender justice space for so long, when we think about pay inequity, we've really talked about it from the perspective of the need for equal pay for equal work, right? And that's why we've seen, legislation along the lines of the Federal Equal Pay Act, which mandates equal pay for equal work. And then we've also seen a number of state laws that, mirror or build upon the federal law. Those protections are absolutely essential. But when we start, in a lot of the work that we're doing, we are directly working with women in some of these lower wage occupations that are female dominated, from domestic work to home care to hospitality to the garment industry. And when you start to think about what women are, the type of work, oftentimes the problems they're facing are not occupational segregation. Um, the the problems that we are facing have to do with the fact that so many women are segregated in these lower wage occupations where they're working incredibly demanding jobs, and yet they're not being paid fairly, right? And
Got
so that has really reshaped some of the policy advocacy we're doing so that we're moving beyond this conception of equal pay for equal work, and we're really starting to think about working towards a living wage, for example, right? What we need to see is that we want to see that minimum wage state by state reflects cost of living and increases annually with inflation. So many of the women that we work with, they are working incredibly difficult jobs and they're having a hard time just making ends meet. And I think one piece of that is their work is incredibly devalued. But I think from a kind of immediate perspective, we want to make sure that these women are getting a basic wage that allows them to live in dignity, right? And that has to do with us increasing and indexing minimum wages state by state and at the federal level. Our federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour, is the wage from the dark ages. And so it's essential that we start to move that ball forward. I think, yeah.
No,
Sorry, Darren,
no,
were
no,
you?
no, no. I was getting ready to parlay that by saying, listen, as you're talking about that, the first thing I think about is, in order to get there, there has to be this transparency too, right? Because that's pretty huge. We're not seeing the transparency when it comes to wages and pay. They can really bridge the gap sometimes. So I was just gonna say, these two things almost kind of go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Don't get me started on or I will get started on talking about
No,
pay transparency.
please get started. Right. There
I
you go.
love talking about pay transparency. So, I think one of the key initiatives that we've worked on in New York City and New York State, along with a number of core organizations, including the Power New York network, is to advance pay transparency protections. And so we worked very closely with Council Member Helen Rosenthal in New York City and Senator Jessica Ramos and Assembly Member Latoya Joyner in New York State to enact pay transparency laws at the local and state levels. Um, those laws we feel are essential towards doing exactly what you said, which is on the one hand, we want to raise wages, but then before we do that, we also need to know a lot about what's happening, how employers are paying people. And so the law in New York State requires employers with 4 or more employees to disclose a pay range in an advertisement for a job, promotion, or transfer opportunity, and to include a job description if one exists. And we think these laws are absolutely critical to both closing the gender pay gap, but also addressing occupational segregation. And there are no number of reasons that they're so important. In terms of occupational segregation, I think for the first time, these laws are giving us a very basic understanding of what employers are paying for different types of jobs. And I think this is something that's incredibly important for workers across the spectrum. It's incredibly important for women and people of color who are already coming to the table with these artificially depressed salaries based on discrimination. And it's incredibly important for employers so that we're all working towards getting to a place where pay is more fair and equitable.
Yeah. We hear about structural discrimination. I mean, we know that particularly when it comes to women of color, what those statistics actually hold. And it's pretty startling, it's pretty embarrassing, and it's sad that we're having this conversation again in 2023. How do we get to the place where we can really hold people accountable in this particular area? Because accountability seems to be the biggest challenge, right? That we know what the problem is, we know what the issue is, but now it's really about holding people accountable so that way we can kind of, right this wrong.
Absolutely. I mean, I think under our prevailing culture of pay secrecy, there are a number of barriers that have prevented us from really addressing pay inequity effectively. I think one of the key things that we're concerned about is that it was, before we had any degree of pay transparency, it was practically impossible to unearth problematic pay disparities, right? We couldn't see where they existed because we had no idea what employers were paying people. That was one piece of it. I think another piece of it is that there was no employer accountability because everything that they were doing was behind closed doors. Another big piece of it is that employers have been able to rely on both conscious and unconscious biases in setting salary, and that perpetuated again because we had no idea what any of these jobs were priced at. And then I think, lastly, we've seen that the workers have had absolutely no leverage in the process. And so all of these things factor into creating this very problematic environment. I think one of the most important pieces and strengths of pay transparency legislation that requires employers to disclose the pay upfront in a job posting is that for the first time, we're requiring employers to be more accountable, right? We can now see what they are potentially paying for different jobs. They have to include that information in the job posting. And so by forcing them to include that information, the idea is that it really encourages them and pushes them to set pay based on more equitable, fair, objective factors, as opposed to pricing the person and not the job. That's been one of our main objectives in pushing for pay transparency legislation, is that employers price the job and not the person. And so that they're looking at factors like their budget, the relevant qualifications for a particular position, what they've paid their existing employees to carry out that role, instead of making ad hoc decisions that are based on each candidate that comes in the door, which we know results in the biases because employers are judging women and people of color differently, and they're often relying on workers' prior salaries to set their future salary. And that's another problem that we know perpetuates the wage gap.
Oh, yeah, Seher, Khawaja, we can talk about this all day. And literally a lot to talk about, unfortunately, but we are out of time, and I do want to get you back, so make sure that you get your calendar ready because we'll have to get you back. So thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I love to be back.
All righty. Taking a quick break. We'll be back with more right after this.
I remember when the Bronx did not really have a media outlet properly representing the people of the Bronx.
BronxNet provides for the community by being a community where people can be empowered to share their voices.
We are in a really great place technologically. We've got all the resources that we need to be effective.
Whether it's through cameras, storytelling, editing, we have provided those services for 30 years.
BronxNet's mission is to be a voice for the community.
To educate,
to inform, and to inspire.
And you can be a part of it. We've built studios for you.
And welcome back. Define American is an organization that's focused on the narrative change of employing the influence of storytelling to present immigrant narratives that are both genuine and multidimensional. They support and advocate for immigrant storytellers through community building, art, world advocacy, and their fellowship. And we've got joining us and sharing more, the Director of Storytell Support and Advocacy at Define American, Bethany Worden. And thank you so much for being with us.
It's so fun to be here. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And when we take a look right now at immigration, a very hot topic across the United States, and we've got the migration issue happening literally as we speak. Talk to me about your perspective on where you see things with regards to immigrants right now.
Well, we think immigrants are a huge part of America. They're a sizable part of the U.S. population. But too often we see negative narratives impacting immigrant communities. And as we all know, negative narratives often lead to negative policies. In the last several years in particular, we've seen a rise in xenophobia that's leading to more difficult conditions for immigrant communities, both for immigrants who've lived here for a long time and for those that are newly arriving. So what we're trying to do is change the narrative around how we talk about immigrants. Our founder, Jose Antonio Vargas, talks about how if there are 45 million immigrants in the U.S., there are 45 million ways to be an immigrant. And we're looking to showcase that broad range of experiences.
We talk about conversations, and when it comes to immigration, those conversations can go run the gamut. We've seen it. We've seen some very damaging and demeaning conversations, almost taking the life out of immigrants as just pure human beings. And so you got to ask the question, how do I really have these conversations, humanize, and also value immigrants, particularly given the fact that we know what the conversation's like?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think a lot of it starts with, once again, allowing immigrants to be individuals and have individual stories, and shy away as much as possible from broad generalizations. Someone's story of how they came here and why they're here is going to be different from someone else's. And so if you are in a situation where someone is trying to make, broad generalizations about immigrants or immigrant communities or what they want, I think it would be helpful to ask, who do you know? Who are you talking about when you're making those broad generalizations? To have a singular person, an individual in mind, I think is helpful, as well as recognizing that all of us are fully formed human beings with wonderful things and with flaws, and allowing everyone to live in their full humanity.
For you, obviously you do a good job of humanizing, telling the story. What is it that makes the immigrant story so compelling?
That is an incredible question. So myself, I'm not an immigrant myself. I was born in the U.S. as a U.S. citizen, but spent a lot of my life living outside of the U.S. And when I moved back to the U.S. in college, I really became much more interested in stories that were coming from perspectives that I'm not usually hearing. I went to film school and I saw a lot of sort of the same kinds of stories being told that I didn't feel like reflected my own experience or the experience of many of my classmates or friends. And what I find really compelling about immigrant storytellers and why we support them is that even though they are, once again, a sizable part of the population, they're often excluded from opportunities to share their stories, from opportunities for artist support. What we do at Define American is to help give up those opportunities, both through our own fellowship programs, but also through helping other programs figure out how to be more inclusive of immigrant stories and storytellers.
When we talk about changing the narrative, obviously we want to do that, right? We want to see the narrative change with the way that sometimes immigrants are depicted. people are portrayed. You do a great job also of making sure that that work is accomplished in terms of doing things to change the narrative. So from Define America, what do you do in that cause to be able to say, listen, we want to be able to tell a different story?
Yeah, we see that both at a mass media level. So my colleagues in the entertainment and digital storytelling consulting teams work on narratives that we see in TV and film, as well as narratives that we see on YouTube. And then in my own program, supporting individual storytellers, one of our most successful campaigns was a program called UndocuJoy, which was based on a poem by an artist, Yosemar Reyes, who was the first artist in residence at Define American. And he felt like so many narratives around being an immigrant, especially an undocumented immigrant, are trauma-based, and he wanted to really flip that on its head. And he, through this poem and the eventual video campaign, invited other undocumented individuals in the U.S. to share their joys. It had a sort of viral moment of those sharing their UndocuJoys. And that's something that we really keep central to all of our work in supporting storytellers, is that there are hard parts of their stories, but there's also really wonderful, human, loving, joyful parts of their stories as well.
If you're just joining us, we got Bethany Worden, who's the Director of Storyteller Support and Advocacy at Define American, and she's been with us. And for somebody who may not be so familiar with the organization Define American, Bethany, a little about your history.
Yeah, we were founded in 2011 by Jose Antonio Vargas, who at the time was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who decided to come out in New York Times Magazine as undocumented. And he wasn't sure what the response to that was going to be, and a group of friends came around him in that experience and said, let's form an organization that would help others share their stories as well. And so we launched with the simple question, how do you define American? And it's since led to programs in research, entertainment, digital storytelling, journalism, and now my own work with artists.
Is there a particular story that's been told that really resonates with you that says, hey, you know, people should know this?
That's a great question. I think for me, one of the stories that I hear often from artists that I find really moving are those who are here either undocumented or asylum seekers or refugees or others with uncertain status that are often left out of programs due to eligibility requirements based around immigration status. And I once had one of these artists tell me that she's gotten so used to being denied opportunities that she stopped applying for them or even looking for them just because of how demoralizing that is. And that's something that really stuck with me and continues to shape our work. We know that it's very difficult to be an artist and storyteller. That's not an easy career path, but I don't think that we need to make it more difficult. And often those eligibility requirements are unnecessary and are not taking into account that there are many of those living in the U.S. who do not have legal residency or do not have a social security number or work authorization, but still need to be supported as artists and storytellers.
From your perspective, what is it that probably does need to be highlighted? I mean, we know about what shouldn't be in the highlights, right? But what do we need to highlight?
Another great question. I mean, I think what we need to highlight is that immigrants are an integral part of the United States and have been since its founding. And we need to be more inclusive of immigrant communities at every level, both from just friendship levels and being welcoming to those in our neighborhoods, especially if they're newly arrived, but also being more inclusive in our policies and for organizations, nonprofits, making sure that they're considering the unique needs of immigrant communities, and at even higher levels, pushing for more inclusion of immigrant communities at all levels.
It hasn't been hard work, given the fact that we know the climate that we're in, and so many people have some real staunch views about immigrant rights, but yet and still to humanize, to tell the story, to bring that parallel, that's pretty hard work in this climate. Do you agree?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think it is hard work, but I think it's important work. I think that it's what's necessary to be a truly multicultural, multiracial, inclusive community. And so I think that they're conversations that we need to be having. And, I think that the easiest place to start is once again like asking individuals about their individual experiences, and allowing those to be multidimensional, and allowing them to be difficult but also joyful, and fully welcoming that complex narrative.
As we look at immigration right now, are you optimistic with the way that things are going? I mean, given the fact that we know that we're talking about buses and migrant workers right now showing up across the United States. We're seeing plenty of resistance that's coming from people across the country. And at the same time, also a welcome embrace. Depending on what side of the aisle you are on, we'll see how the statistics play out. But are you optimistic that, given the fact that what we're seeing right now in our country is playing out, that immigration will get a better look?
Oh, optimism, that's a hard one. I think that I'm optimistic in the sense that we are very openly talking about immigration. I'm hoping that leads to more immigrant communities having visibility. It's definitely difficult, though, once again, as we're talking about with like the rise of xenophobia in the last few years. We want that like extra attention to be good and helpful. I think that what we can do once again at an individual level is being really mindful of including immigrants in our community decisions, being really mindful to be considering the ways that we can be more welcoming to immigrant communities, and hopefully not just get caught in the crossfire of different political opinions, but once again, like really letting people be humans and interacting as humans.
Yeah. Bethany, what are some of the ways, that we could be an ally? Because I remember during, COVID, we had Black Lives Matter, George Floyd. A lot of people said, well, how can I be an ally to communities of color, African Americans, during a time like this? And you had to get that answer from within. From within the environment of the immigrant community, what can you tell us about being that ally? What can somebody do?
That's a really great question, too. And once again, as not an immigrant myself, but coming at this as an ally, I'm not sure that I can speak for everyone. But from what I'm hearing, I think a great way to be an ally, once again, is if you are part of an organization that has eligibility policies that are currently based on immigration status. So whether that be healthcare or arts or education or something else, be considering whether those are necessary. Often there's sort of a copy-paste kind of response that can happen, where it's like, oh, we've just always done things this way, without really like considering who it's impacting and how. And taking a moment to figure out if those are necessary. Can you be more inclusive of immigrant students? Can you be more inclusive of immigrant artists? Can you find ways to be providing healthcare or other social services to immigrant communities? I think that's a great way to be an ally, is to take on some of that labor of looking at your programs yourself without having someone come to you first and ask you to make the change.
I think a lot of allies were formed during the COVID pandemic, where we all just had to come together and really bear it and try to make it through. When we talk about COVID, a huge impact, I would assume, for the immigrant community. I won't just say assume, I know. I've had conversations and interviews before. But from your boots on the ground and from your bird's eye view, how did you see COVID playing out for the immigrant community?
Yeah, I think we saw this really split narrative, where we saw lots of hateful words and hateful actions leading to xenophobic actions against immigrant communities, while at the same time we saw this really helpful and positive narrative that was highlighting how many immigrants are part of frontline workers, immigrant healthcare workers, immigrant farm workers, immigrant teachers, all of these individuals that were really responding to the pandemic, even while being often very far from their own families and maybe not being able to travel to see them. And so I think that, coming out of the pandemic, there's sort of this dissonance that's left, but once again, of those two different narratives. On the one hand, really celebrating the work of immigrant frontline workers, but then also this really nasty history of xenophobic rhetoric and actions.
You yourself are, literally those one of many that are out there in terms of support and a resource. I think the biggest challenge that a lot of people faced during that time is that it further exacerbated the lack of access to resources that people didn't have. You got you have this pandemic going on, and you've got people out there on the front lines saying, "Listen, we are trying to access resources," and now hearing those in the immigrant community, they're saying, COVID just made it further, shine a light further on the fact of access to resources and the disparities that exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my work with artists and storytellers in particular, I think that we saw the way that the pandemic was difficult for artists and storytellers across the board. There's an organization, Artist Relief, that did a survey and found that something like 90% of artists lost income during the pandemic due to not being able to perform or exhibit or things like that. And in some ways, that was a really bonding experience for artists across different backgrounds. Many of the programs that had currently had exclusionary immigration status requirements with them dropped those during COVID, which was really wonderful. And I think, as we're coming out of that time, I'm hoping that we can bring some of that bonding and solidarity with us. Once again, the sort of at a very human level, the way that we can be supporting one another and be inclusive all the time, even when it's not, sort of once in a history pandemic.
For people who want to find out ways that they could be an ally and really support the work of Define American and the work that you've got going on, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, you can find our website at defineamerican.com. We publish all of our research reports and inclusive guides and recommendations for how to work with immigrant storytellers, all on our website. You can also follow us on Instagram at Define American, where we share sort of bite-sized resources as well as profiles of different immigrant artists and change makers. And then if you have any more questions or want to talk about any of this in more detail, feel free to email me, Bethany at defineamerican.com.
Well, Bethany, certainly want to thank you for joining us. And as we look forward towards the summer, anything that you want our viewers to know about, to look out for and to watch out for?
Oh, that's fun. We have some exciting Instagram profiles coming out soon of some artists, immigrant artists that you want to take a look at. And then also, we, in addition to our fellowship program, do immigrant storyteller gatherings around the country, and you can find out more information about that on our website and Instagram as well. Maybe there'll be one coming to your city soon.
All right. Well, Bethany Worden, we want to thank you so much for being with us. She is the Director of Storyteller Support and Advocacy for Define American. And glad to have you. Glad to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be here.
All righty. Well, it's an honor to have you. We are taking a quick break. We want you to stay with us. We'll be right back after this. And welcome back. Emerest Connect offers a dedicated community of home care professionals specializing in holistic wellness. Their cohesive and technology-driven remote healthcare collective prioritizes the physical, mental, and emotional health of clients. Here now and joining us is the Emerest Connect's CEO, Josh Klein, and COO, Jack Bernath. And we thank you so much for joining us both.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having us. We appreciate it.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Thank you. And so, for somebody who may not be so familiar with Emerest Connect, let's walk through a little bit about the work that you're doing and really how you're trying to deal with home care services.
So, first of all, home care is changing. The population that we're so blessed to serve, there's lots of needs for the underserved communities. And what we truly try to accomplish is to give patients an opportunity to live healthier and happier in their homes by implementing and teaching them ways to keep them healthy, whether it's through technologies and ways forward in order to get good outcomes so they can do well at home.
We hear a lot about the word holistic wellness, and I know that's a word that you tend to use. How do you define holistic wellness from your perspective?
Well, holistic to us is if you, as a home care provider, it's usually mostly clinical. When you hear companies trying to accomplish outcomes, it's usually with doctors, nurses, that which is obviously very, very important, getting access to people to have proper medicine. But to truly address their needs, there has to be, as like we call, like you said, the holistic approach, which is also addressing their social determinants of health, making sure that they have proper food, proper housing. In order for somebody to feel good and feel healthy, you cannot ignore all those factors that is ordinarily not addressed in a doctor's office. So the second we do not address to making sure that we combat loneliness, depression, mental health, and wellness, when that's not doing it holistically. And addressing all those needs truly incorporates everything to get outcomes for the people that, frankly, are underserved and are usually put by the wayside.
Yeah. I want to tackle the topic of telehealth for a minute because I know that's pretty huge these days. Before COVID, but after COVID, certainly, and during COVID, we saw the emergence of telehealth. And so, for your organization, talk to me about how you've been dealing with telehealth and the clients you serve.
I'm glad that you brought up COVID because COVID, necessity is the mother of all invention. And what COVID truly did is operators like Jack and myself, we had a responsibility of thousands of lives throughout the 5 boroughs in multiple states throughout the country. And when you had so many elderly that we were responsible for, did either not have access to people to come and help them because COVID wouldn't allow them to come in or they didn't want, or elderly patients were afraid to let one in their home. So naturally, we did a risk stratification and said, our responsibility is to make sure that they have access to people to at least to communicate. And when COVID hit day one, we put in thousands of tablets in patients' homes and started having effective communication, just seeing what their needs, besides clinical needs, is to have somebody to talk to. COVID did that, and lots of companies identified that. But frankly, Jack and I believe that companies stayed stuck. They accomplished a certain amount, but they never chiseled away at truly delivering products than just, as they say, telehealth that most people would know is putting in a device, some peripherals such as taking their blood pressure, monitoring them, but not truly engaging with what those outcomes are. And that's what separates us apart. Is we never stopped at 2020. Everything that we're doing is what we can and we continue to do is perfecting our model as much as possible to get true outcomes and interventions once these alerts come in and arise. So if a patient needs a doctor, we will send that to them, or a patient needs somebody from a social side to talk to because they're lonely and depressed, we intervene and have programs that are tailored to all those needs.
Yeah, let me bring Jack in and Jack, talk to me about what have you learned and what have you tried to uh, add to the toolbox, given the fact that COVID did expose a lot of things, particularly the disparities in the healthcare system.
So I'm going to add on to what Josh was saying. When COVID hit and, there was no access to certain things that we added these tablets and, we added so much more in the patient's homes to be able to communicate with them and Emerest Connect is adding a lot on that, not by just having the typical telehealth engagement with patients, gaming, and the communities, and using a lot of those tools going ahead is a lot of what we're doing and keep on doing, helping the population, which are elderly at home and don't go out. And obviously, COVID is, when it was strong, but this is a population which is always where they can't leave their homes and things like that, where we're adding on a lot of different services through technology to making sure that all these stuff is getting done in the homes.
Well, little birdie told me that you got something called remote patient monitoring. So can you share with me a little bit about remote patient monitoring and how that actually plays into a little bit what we're talking about here?
So remote patient monitoring, typical remote patient monitoring is these tablets and these peripherals, which is being put into the patient's homes, where they're monitoring their blood pressure, their O2 set, a scale for patients which are cardiac patients, diabetic patients are getting other stuff, so which are being monitored. That's the typical remote patient monitoring, where all these numbers come in and we see what's happening. A lot of these companies, what they would do, go back to and see with doctors, with the PCPs, where it takes them. What we add on to that is, we follow through with a whole lot of different services where we're making sure that a patient stays at home and doesn't have to wait for 2 weeks of a doctor's appointment to follow up on all of those issues where is arising right there in the home.
What I will add is the intervention, for example, ordinarily where an emergency when our system, we have 24-hour nurses that are truly engaging with our patients. And if an alert comes in and it warrants the level of an acute emergency, our internal paramedicine system will send somebody to the home and make an assessment. And if it's something that truly needs, if somebody's, for example, having a heart attack and they need a cath lab to make sure that the vessels are open, they're obviously our internal ambulance will take them. But if there is something that intervention, if they might just need as simple as fluids or a medication adjustment, we will do that in order to avoid that unnecessary hospitalization.
Yeah. One of the things we talk about is hospitalization rates. Talk to me about how this is actually dealt with the hospitalization rate.
We've successfully, for the highest utilizers of certain payers in New York State, we've reduced their hospitalization by more than 25%. There's lots of reasons, lots of factors why patients end up in the hospital. Sometimes patients are just, frankly,
lonely at home.
They're lonely at home, and when something bothers them, the initial knee-jerk reaction, or a family member will be on the phone. Their mom lives right here in the Bronx. They live in Nebraska, and the mom is like, "Oh, I'm not feeling well." Their knee-jerk reaction is to call 911. And because we have so many things that we have most of the tools that an emergency room would have. So if somebody, for example, needs an x-ray because they're coughing and we want to make sure that they don't have something like pneumonia, we will send x-ray to the patient's home. If they need certain blood work, so we can do almost anything. It's almost like in a hospital at home setting, and to do everything to avoid hospitalization. As you know, the highest utilizing cost in the healthcare system is a patient ending up in a hospital. So any intervention which we have in our network that can to avoid a hospitalization, as I say, we have that in our toolbox.
Yeah, Jack, talk to me, because when we talk about avoiding these hospitalizations and things like that, one of the ways is about connection and really staying connected, and whether that's with a family person or with other persons as well. But give me a little bit about the social connection component, because I think that's something that you're working to do is really improve that as well.
Right. So as Josh started talking about, a lot of these patients, when they're isolated, they're home, they're bored, or they have any kind of other mental problems, 911 would be the first to think, oh, I'm having a problem, and going and holding them. And as soon as the, 911 would enter the home, this patient is being taken to the hospital. What we're doing with all this Emerest Connect, with this technology, this gaming we're doing, and all these interactions we're doing with patients through these devices we're having in a patient's home, that keeps them engaged, that keeps them busy, keeps them happy, and keeps them out of all those troubles. They're making their own communities between the elderly. They're enjoying. They're having a good time. They're waiting to start those programs we're having in the morning. You know, when we start these programs, a lot of them, we don't have to wait for them. They're waiting for us for the program to start. That's an amazing, amazing tools, which we're seeing their patients are engaging a lot, and they're waiting for these kind of programs. And we're seeing, these numbers. What we're seeing is on the social side as well as on the clinical side, that those patients are not ending up in the hospital so much, and we are avoiding hospitalizations just simple by doing all these different things.
Yeah, I know we were talking in the last segment about disparities, and but one of the things that happens in the health industry is there are some health disparities. What are you doing in the area of looking at these health disparities and also being able to address and tackle that?
As we're both sitting in our own television studio. That is a unique television studio. It's a little bit different from what you're on, which is behind us are these monitor walls on both sides, which gives programming to the elderly. And this is housed right here in the Bronx. And Jack and myself wanted it right here. We could have gone in lots of different areas where, Studio City could have been. And we wanted to make a statement and invest in an area such as the Bronx, where there usually isn't ordinarily these tech-driven companies, is bringing in, ushering in, and making access. The first opportunity that Jack and I had to do home care was right here in the Bronx. Never forgetting and understanding that so many don't have access to healthcare. They're unfortunately not eating healthy. To truly understand who are the people that need it most. Chasing the dollars is not what's going to help you build a good company. Understanding the population, caring for the underserved, making sure that that's a priority. There are thousands of patients that Jack and I are blessed to serve, for them to be. And we're very, very, very proud of that fact, is to make sure that, especially the underserved, and we don't just say it, we practice what we preach. Right here in the Bronx, in this building, just to give you an idea, is you, on the previous segment, you were talking about the job market. Jack and I are two operators that have invested, most probably more than any sector period, for people that have low income jobs. Have made sure that, besides that we fight for them, but that's just a fight, but put our money where our mouth is, paying them more, advocating to help them pay more. We have right here in our building a 5-star salon that offer caregivers. They can get their hair, nails done, manicures, pedicures. It's a beautiful lounge for them, understanding in this population that usually ordinarily doesn't get these type of services. The big tech companies are very used to having all these fancy perks, but the people that are delivering the care in these homes are usually, they in our mind, underpaid, undervalued. And that is something that Jack and I are always a champion of, and being at the front of all of this. And we're not just saying it, we're investing in our workforce and doing it right in certain areas where it's not the ritzy titsy. To us, the Bronx is the ritzy titsy.
Yeah, well, the Bronx is the place to be, and obviously, it's home for us, and we know there are a lot of great things that happen here in the borough of the Bronx, and now we're glad to be talking about Emerest Connect and the work that's going on. For people who are caregivers, I think you talked about that as well, that they're very important. I mean, you have patients, but then you also have caregivers. What else is available for a caregiver through Emerest Connect?
So I think, as Josh said, so Emerest Connect is the technology piece more on the patient side. What we have as a company, as you know, we do, starting with home care, we have these employees working for us. So this is an add-on, which Josh was just explaining, was the UAD. UAD means where they have a salon coming in and having for free. They're getting manicures, pedicures, their hair done, and they have a lounge where they lounge, and we make them feel good about themselves. As Josh said, a lot of these caregivers are, not a lot, all of them, they're underpaid and they're having a very hard job. To us, they are the hardest workers. You know, going into a patient, you know, we're doing this for 25 years. We wouldn't be able to be in the patient's home for more than 20 minutes. They are there for hours and hours and hours and working. You know, what we have seen in the past, all these years doing home care, a lot of, you know, we're always afraid. How is the patient? How are these employees to the patients? We as a company, we always make sure how the patient is to the employee. You know, a lot of these employees are getting harassed. So we're doing and working very, very hard on the employee side to have these employees, to give them as much as we can, more than we can, and more than others, to make sure that they are a happy and well taken care of employee. And as Josh said, we have these sites, the UX sites, which we're doing for our employees, and a lot, and most where we started with these were in the Bronx. Bronx is a very, very important borough for us.
I just want to add on that. You were saying about their job. To us, they're just as important as a physician. Sometimes, and one of the reasons why we do a lot of these investments in our workforce is a doctor sees a patient. Of course, they're talented and they went to school to identify, but a caregiver that's in a patient's home for a longer period of time can add so much more value, and it's building them. We have lots of programs internally that we want home health aides to grow. Nobody wants to stay stagnant. And if somebody wants to become an LPN, we have these things we want. The same way we want to grow as people, these caregivers have the hardest job in the world. They sometimes take 2 buses, 4 trains, leave 2 kids at home with somebody to watch their kids. If we lose sight for 1 second for the well-being of the people that are delivering the care, we're not doing our job.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, we got to leave it there. Thank you so much for talking and sharing with us. Glad to have you. Glad to know a little bit more about Emerest Connect, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a
All
great
righty.
day.
You guys take care. All right. Well, before we end our program, BronxNet is thrilled to mark 30 years of positive impact right here in the borough of the Bronx. Our latest venture, the BronxNet Media and Technology Studios in the South Bronx, represents our most significant and yet, our most significant step, yet it's also bridging the digital gap. Can't do it alone, though. We need your support. So, your contribution ensures access to cutting-edge studios, top-quality equipment, and professional development opportunities for individuals of all ages in the Bronx. We encourage you to join us in shaping a brighter future in technology and media. So, let's work together to make the Bronx a better place for everyone. Donate today at BronxNet.org, and let's create a lasting impact together. Come to the end of our show today. We want to thank you and hope that you enjoyed this week's discussion on the Bronx Social Justice Anti-Violence Forum. And if you want to rewatch this week's episode, guess what? Recablecast right here on BronxNet.org. Now, if you want to join the conversation, you want to put your point of view out there, gotta do it. Do it. Meet us, social media at BronxNet TV. All right, we'll elevate the conversation, bring some further awareness. Come on back next week. I'm Daren Jaime saying take care. God bless.